Greetings, this is GBA 383. The course is Business and Society, and this chapter 7 is about the ethics of job discrimination. We all know that job discrimination is illegal in many forms. However, there are also ethical elements to it. Because no matter what, even though things are illegal, people still behave in certain ways. And so it's important to take a two-pronged approach to things. Obviously, we need to recognize there's the ethical side of things as well as the legal side of things. And just because we follow the law, as we know, that doesn't mean that we've done enough. So we want to make sure that our motivations to do things to end discrimination in the workplace is really based on ethical norms as well as legal norms. People deserve to be able to do their job to the best of their ability without interference, without being judged for things that are non-job related. So it is important for us to ensure that job discrimination is eliminated or minimized in the workplace to the best of our abilities. There are 5 key learning objectives in this chapter. Number 1, we're going to discuss the legal climate and some of the key legal decisions that affect the way discrimination in the workplace is viewed. We will analyze the nature of job discrimination based on the study of intentional, unintentional, individual, and institutional forms of discrimination. This is important to recognize that discrimination does not have to be intentional. In fact, often it's unintentional, but we are still held liable and accountable for our behaviors. Number 3, outline the extent of employment discrimination by making comparisons among groups. So looking at where we see the disparities, why some groups are not being hired at the same rates as others, and really getting into making the case, statistically speaking, for why employment discrimination actually exists. Number 7, we'll analyze discrimination using utilitarian, rights-based, and justice-based arguments. And lastly, examine the policy of affirmative action from a practical, legal, and moral point of view. Affirmative action is often very misunderstood, and it's important to recognize that affirmative action's goal is to create a level playing field, very much in alignment with the justice approach to things. And affirmative action is about ensuring that we have given assistance where needed for people affirmatively to help them to be able to compete. And it has legal implications. There's no reason that we are being told to hire somebody who is unqualified for a job. But in reality, our job is to make sure that we have done the best we can to ensure that we have a level playing field and that everybody has the opportunity to have access to resources. It is not about quotas at all. So some of the key terms that we'll be addressing in this chapter around this notion of illegal discrimination is the notion of what is just, or how do we apply the justice theories? How do we make sure that things are fair? The notion of equality and how it differs from equity or fairness. They're 2 separate topics. Equality means everybody gets treated the same. And in some aspects of our hiring process, we need to treat everybody the same. But in other aspects, we have to differentiate or discriminate. And I don't mean illegal discrimination, because differentiation and discrimination mean the same thing. What the textbook should have been more clear about is the notion of illegal discrimination, because illegal discrimination is where we use non-job related characteristics to make hiring decisions versus discriminating based on job related characteristics such as knowledge, skills, and abilities, experience, etc., etc. So when we talk about equality versus equity, equality is about treating everybody the same. And there are contexts where that makes perfect sense. But when we recognize that not everybody has the same access to opportunities, that's where the notion of equity, giving to those who need additional assistance a lift up, is key. And then we have moral rights. What are our rights and duties? around this. And then lastly, the notion of racism and what does it mean about racism. There's intentional racism where I purposefully and intentionally choose to treat someone different because of their race. And then there's, institutional level racism, or sexism or anything else out there, and how those issues are a system that's embedded, and in an unconscious way. It doesn't we don't recognize how we people are being treated differentially under the law and under the eyes of society in the institutions that are out there. So it's a very difficult topic. We're not going to get into that level of detail in this particular class because we just don't have the time to do that. But I just want you to be aware that issues like racism and sexism can exist at an institutional level, and because the system has been designed to benefit one group or another, and we're not even aware of it anymore because it is so taken for granted. Our three foci areas in this chapter are the nature and extent of discrimination, sort of what is it, what does it look like, and how pervasive is it. The ethical aspects of discriminatory behavior, meaning illegal discriminatory behavior, what are the ethical considerations as we do that, and then the diversity and affirmative action in business, and what does that mean to have diversity in your business, what are the benefits from that, and then the notion of affirmative action and where that fits into the context of um, ethical behaviors. So as I reviewed chapter 7, I was disappointed in their approach to discussing the wide range of activities and legal cases that were involved in illegal discrimination. I want to differentiate between, as I said, discrimination versus illegal discrimination. And differentiation or discrimination is exactly the same thing. We want to differentiate between job candidates. We want to differentiate between students applying for admission to a university, for example. Illegal discrimination is when we use non-job related characteristics and criteria in order to make a hiring decision. So the concern that I have about this chapter is that really it only addresses the issue of affirmative action when the cases and the issues involved in job discrimination are so much broader and wider than that. But I'm going to try to follow the tone of the textbook chapter while adding in some things for you to understand and listen to, and recognize that this is not a simple situation, that it's more expansive and more complicated than I think this chapter is trying to address. And this is an area of expertise for me. I'm an editor on an employment law textbook, so I have done extensive research and reading on different legal cases regarding job discrimination, or illegal job discrimination. So I want to be very clear, where I'm coming from with this. I'm not changing the PowerPoint slides, but I am going to try to add in details here and there for your awareness so that you recognize what's going on. Now, the textbook addresses two particular cases regarding affirmative action plans that were existing in a school, and whether or not they were legal to do so. And the first one was the University of Texas at Austin. And this was an important case because it had reversed a previous Supreme Court decision, or at least maybe fine-tuned it a bit more, maybe would be a better word, and basically arguing that affirmative action plans are completely fine when their goal was to ensure that that we have a diverse student body, to expose students to a diverse student body from different geographical areas, socioeconomic classes, experience, backgrounds, race, color, religion, you name it. Our goal is to ensure students are exposed to all sorts of different ideas and opinions, not just a narrow point of view. If you want to believe a certain thing, you can go to a private school that will reinforce a certain belief, but a public school has an obligation to ensure that everybody's identity is represented in that. And this is part of the issue that we're facing right now with these school choice issues, which is they believe that parents should have a real voice in the content of what's taught in public schools. And the challenge, of course, is that there are plenty of things that our kids are going to get exposed to that we don't agree with, but that there are kids and parents who have alternative points of view on these things, and and what do we decide is acceptable and not acceptable. And we want to make sure that they're exposed to as much as they can to make their own decisions for themselves. And so while you might argue K through 12 is one point of view, and I would agree that it is different than college, I still believe wholeheartedly that in the public schools that we cannot decide that one person's point of view, one person's religion, one person's perspective is the way to go, that we need to expand that to include all sorts of different points of view and ideas for our kids to learn empathy, for our kids to learn that their history is not, their perspective on history is not the only perspective out there, that there are different points of view that they need to learn and understand. So the Austin case, the UT Austin case, basically argued that that it is okay for us to have an affirmative action plan that does expand and ensure that kids are exposed to diversity in many, many ways. Now, the Grutter versus Bollinger had significance regarding hiring programs. For example, if an organization had two equal candidates, was it okay for the organization to hire the racial or ethnic minority or the women or whoever was the marginalized group that was engaged in the affirmative action? Did they have the right to hire them over a majority person in that circumstance? And what we saw with Grutter versus Bollinger is that it still supported this notion, right, that that having diverse experiences for our student bodies was incredibly important, and they needed to have that. And as long as the affirmative action plan it was addressed in a very narrow way, what they were trying to do, that Grutter versus Bollinger, that there was no quote unquote reverse discrimination. Let me be clear. There's no such thing as reverse discrimination. Basically, what that means is discrimination is discrimination. Illegal discrimination is illegal discrimination. And in this situation, Grutter basically was arguing that she was not being hired, not being admitted into law school because minority groups were getting an advantage over her. They were equally qualified, but they were bringing in the minority students over her, and so she did not get admitted into University of Michigan Law School. And the argument, though, was that ultimately she was trying to argue that there was too much weight based on race, but the Supreme Court said no. What they're doing is completely fine. It is if the goal is to achieve diversity, and their plan was narrowly tailored to achieve that goal, as it says in the textbook, and that the University of Michigan's law school program met that criteria, so she was out of luck. Of course, people are still going to be grumpy about it, right? I mean, they're going to be unhappy because she was denied admission. They're going to feel like everybody else has got opportunities over them. But here's what came out of that. Number one, many businesses believe that that the support of diversity is important in a rapidly globalizing world, and that is absolutely true. That we know organizations that embrace diversity in all forms are better able to perform and compete as long as their workplace is inclusive and allows for differences of opinions and opportunities and ideas to bubble up and to be utilized. It's a different thing to say we have a diverse company and then we don't do things to help people to feel like they can participate and be a part of our company and our culture. So we need inclusive behaviors and inclusivity in our system and in our policies and procedures to ensure that that diverse workforce ultimately becomes a high performing workforce, and we need to have that. And those companies that are successful in engaging that are absolutely much more successful in the workplace than others that are insular and homogeneous. There are beliefs that people believe that affirmative action is unjust reverse discrimination, quote unquote. And I'm going to disagree with that, except under one circumstance where organizations are choosing to engage in quotas where quotas are illegal. And if organizations are choosing quotas in the name of affirmative action, absolutely, I believe that that is a form of discrimination. But when they are truthfully following what the law says, and well, it's actually not a law. Affirmative action is actually an executive order. If they are following the executive order to the letter of the law, the spirit of the law, and what it is that they're trying to accomplish, that is not a form of reverse discrimination. It means that white people just need to be able to compete. They need to recognize that they have to up their game in order to be able to compete on that level playing field, because that's ultimately what they're trying to do, is they're trying to create a level playing field for everybody in that circumstance.